This year's Templeton lecturer is Dru Gladney, a professor of anthropology at Pomona College. He has been studying religious and ethnic minorities in China since forever. I don't have the date in front of me. But he has been a fellow at Harvard University, at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, at the East-West Center in Honolulu. He received his Ph.D. at the University of Washington, and he has a plethora of books on the subject of Chinese minorities. He has also had training at Peking University, Bosporus University in Istanbul, Moscow State University, and Xinjiang University in Western China. So we've asked him today to speak on the subject of Islam in China. Please welcome Professor Dru Gladney.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight, and it's a real honor for me to speak to this group, particularly be along the list of the previous speakers, to be among that group. It's a great honor. And I am particularly interested in covering some ground that some of you may have traveled in, and some of you have rarely heard of, but hopefully to tie it into some current events. As you know, maps matter, but maps move, and also their boundaries and the people within them often move, even especially when we don't want them to. And so this map from the 1920s indicates that there was a place, some people on some maps, called Eastern Turkestan. I wanted to cover a number of points about this region that is becoming more in the news recently due to a group of people that have been accused of being terrorists and separatists by the Chinese government. And I'll try to cover a few points related to the people known as the Uighur. If it looks like I'm trying to do too much in one evening lecture, I think you only have Alan to blame. This is his email that he sent me, and he not only wants an overview of Islam in China with particular attention to the Uighurs, the question of religious extremism, government handling of religious and ethnic minorities, and anything else you think is important for an American audience. So those are my marching instructions, and I intend to cover each one of those bases. So I'll try to be quick. It's not really Alan's fault. This happens to be a part of my duties at Pomona College. Some of these videos aren't loading. This is Senator Mitchell's testimony recently about the knifings in Jerusalem, which reminded me of some knifings in China. And what struck me about the knifings in Jerusalem and in China was the response, basically to set up more walls, to set up more barriers, to keep these people apart, as if that would resolve the problem. China has built an iron Great Wall. It started its One Belt, One Road campaign, and part of it has to do with trying to rein in the violence that is spreading throughout China, but also throughout increasingly outside of China and recently in Thailand. We'll talk about that. But as I was thinking about this lecture, I really was poring over, thanks to my students. Of course, I'm teaching on China and anthropology of China, A. Doak Barnett's extraordinary corpus of work. And in Michael Oxenberg's obituary, he pointed out how Doak Barnett was one of the foremost influences on the current U.S.-China relationship. And if it wasn't for him and his thoughtfulness, maybe some of the ways we framed that relationship would not be here today. In fact, I was not at all surprised to see that Mike Lampton is giving the Barnett-Oxenberg lecture just this week. And so his memory and the legacy of Mike Oxenberg, who was my mentor in Hawaii and brought me to Hawaii, still lives on. And some of the issues that Doak Barnett looked at are still framed, particularly this idea of containment without isolation of China. And what we've seen just today with the flyovers of the Spratly Islands, what we've seen with recent visits by Xi Jinping to Britain, is this concern that China is spreading throughout the globe, and we need to somehow continue to contain Chinese influence, if not its population, its military, et cetera, particularly as it builds a deep blue navy. Now, what I was struck by Doak Barnett's observations in his last most significant book, China's Great Far West, was that he had visited this region known as Xinjiang in 1948. He was born in China to missionary parents, and instead of leaving China when most Westerners left at that period after the World War II, the Sino-Japanese War, and then before that, and then the nationalist communist Civil War, Westerners made themselves scarce, rightfully so, but Barnett stayed. He stayed until 1950, and he made a trip to Western China, particularly to this region known as Xinjiang, and then he went back in 1988 when he got back into China. And his observations comparing the firsthand views are tremendous. And the one thing that leapt out is he looked at the population of the Chinese, Han Chinese in the region is only about 6% in 48. And interestingly enough, I found Chinese statistics as well. And this is a Chinese book published in China that's been translated here for you, in which they also agreed that there's only 7% Han in the 40s, and today 38, maybe some scholars say 39, 40% are the Uighurs now a minority in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, or like the Inner Mongolians of Inner Mongolia, or are they still a majority, a bare majority like the Tibetans? Nevertheless, we know that this dramatic population growth, as we see in this little video of the Syrian migrants crossing into Eastern Europe, is an unsettling time for populations, resident populations. I submit to you that what Eastern Europe and Europe is experiencing with this influx of migrants, which is toppling governments, is minuscule compared to what the Uighurs and the local residents of Xinjiang had to experience over the last 40 years. So you can quibble about, is it 42% or 39%? But by Chinese and Ado Barnett's personal observations, we know that the population is just blown up. And so my feeling, and I know this lecture series is about religion, and I will talk about religion and Islam in the region, but my feeling that the problems about this region, and I've been going there for about 30 years, is very little to do with religion. Religion is important, but it's all provoked by this extraordinary influx of migration, untrammeled, unregulated, and often encouraged influx of Han Chinese into this region that was not their original place of residence. Now, we do have other maps that suggest that the Uyghurs have had a long history in this region. Chinese want to argue this area has always been part of China. This dates to what was known as the Empire of the Uighuristan, period about 7th, 8th, 9th century, Turkic Khanate. The Uyghurs were a farming empire, and they spread into this region that is now part of Xinjiang. The Chinese always have called this region Xinjiang, and they want to say that it's always been part of China, but I joke with my colleagues in China that if you really want to say it's always been part of China, they don't like calling it Eastern Turkestan. You're not allowed to use that word anymore. In China, for a while, it was permitted. Academics could use it. Now it's heavily restricted. I said, why call it Xinjiang? Because as you know, some of you know, in Chinese, Xinjiang means new region, new territory. So it's always been part of China. Why is it called Xinjiang? So it's been difficult to integrate this region into China, and this is the subject of China's Move West. This is a program that has been part of a policy that's been growing. Deng Xiaoping launched the initial developmental policies along the southeast coast, we know, then Jiang Zemin a little bit more into the interior, particularly into Sichuan. And now under Hu Jintao, we had a movement into the west. The Silk Road corridor was developed. But now under Xi Jinping, we have this Iron Silk Road extending Chinese influence even greater and integration of this region, but also trying to leap from that region and move into Central Asia and into Europe. So this region still is very important. Notice that this Iron Silk Road, China has committed an investment of $140 billion to this project, whereas President Obama, in terms of our development of rail and infrastructure, has committed about $40 billion at this stage, or $50 billion at this stage. So there is an imbalance there, and it's caused a lot of eyebrows to be raised. What exactly are China's intentions? Now, this map I had developed when I was at the Pacific Basin Institute at Pomona College. It is online on our website there at Pomona, and it's a moving map. And I think we tend to believe that these borders that surround nation states around the globe are fairly permanent. What we are being shown, however, since the end of the former Soviet Union is that's no longer the case. And one of the arguments I'll make in this lecture is that it's these transnational, translocal, global movements, ideas, peoples, and religious ideologies that are unsettling to these nation states. And they're blurring the boundaries between the nation and the state. And one of the appeals of ISIS is that it wants to be a state, but not a nation. It's the Islamic State. Now for China, it's an empire that's built, it's a nation state built on the framework of an ancient empire. Lu Xunpai once pointed out. We have the 5 autonomous regions now in the Western region, but they really were part of China's development pattern. Over history, we saw that the Han Chinese were mostly in the North China Plain. In the Han Dynasty, they moved out onto that Silk Route corridor, the Huis corridor. And because of the geography of that region, and I know many of you have traveled out that way, they're confined to that area of development, and infrastructural rail or road networks have to go through that valley. Even in the Great Tang Dynasty, we saw this pattern of expansion. And when these dynasties reverted to their old Chinese-controlled boundaries, they moved back into the North China Plain. A foreign conquest dynasty, the Liao, moved things up into the northeast for the first time, but it really was the Mongols and then the Manchus under the Qing that extended China far beyond its current borders and gave us the map of the current People's Republic of China. Interestingly enough, under the Manchus, of course, they included Outer Mongolia as part of their reign, and the nationalists who took over China briefly before the communists also included Outer Mongolia as part of their map. And earlier maps of the KMT, the Kuomintang in Taiwan, actually included Mongolia as well. Recently they've changed that, but who knows, maybe once they get reelected, it's something they might take another visit at. So you can go and look at that if you're interested on our website. But the point is that the Silk Road is not just an overland route, it never was. We also have maritime Silk Roads that were often linked up on some overland routes like the Burma Road. China's 4C strategy, Suhai, is trying to link some of these roads by sea. Now, why is it that Han Chinese populations generally confine themselves to the North China Plain? It's this line here that's very, very important. This is the 15-inch rainfall line that allows for agriculture on one side, but mostly pastoralism and steppe-based short-term agriculture in the north and the west. So this is what controlled populations. And interestingly enough, the rainfall, etc., Fei Xiaotong, China's leading anthropologist trained under Bronislaw Malinowski, once argued that the Han people were basically the farming people. Minorities were non-farmers. And that's sort of the basis of China's ecologically based nationalities policy. I think he didn't know or forgot the fact that the Thai and the Koreans, who are also minorities, had been farming for many millennia. But nevertheless, this does show us a current population distribution pattern, which is still pretty similar despite this mass migration of Han Chinese out west. We know the Silk Roads are ancient, but we also know that the modern trade routes are going to follow the same corridor. Now, I was sort of struck by the fact that the Silk Road often linked up to the maritime Silk routes by this overland route, which was known as the Burma Road, which played a very important role in World War II and may have had a role in why I got interested in studying China and minorities. My father was a flyer, a hump flyer. Some of you know who those guys were. There he is. He's got the characteristic Gladney beak. There he flew 62 missions, not in the small fighter pilots, but in the larger transport ships, from Assam, India, to Chengdu, Chongqing, and Kunming as an airlift. Some people think that this was the key to keeping the Chinese army well-fueled and stocked, that kept the Japanese at bay, because the Burma Road had been cut off. Also led to the Berlin airlift. Interestingly enough, there's a new documentary film being made about this, and they're going to fly the hump in these C-47s, a restored C-47, on November 15th. If you're interested in going on that flight, for $35,000, a Chinese businesswoman from San Francisco will match your contribution and will help fund this project. You can see me afterwards if you're interested. Needless to say, I'm very interested in supporting this. My dad spent many years of his life in China and raised me on stories about the wild minorities in these border areas and some of the stories that he told. The flying tiger story is fairly well known. It's known by every Chinese. They grow up, school kids all. It's more known here because of John Wayne's movie. But the hump flyer story is not well told. Now, this is important, I think, also for realizing that how critical that Burma Road was for linking up China with the outside. Today, when we Google Silk Roads or we go on Wikipedia, we don't get maps of the old Silk Road. We don't get the Burma Road or the Maritime Silk Road. We get this, the Silk Road, Cyber Silk Road. And it reminds us that this deep web site, which was used for smuggling, it's sort of been clamped down on and cracked down on, was a site for illicit trade. The Silk Road was always a site for illicit trade. And Muslims in China were very engaged along that road as traders. Why? Because they were often marginalized. Many Muslims were not allowed to live inside the cities of China. They had their own districts. And that pattern has continued today. So I think the Silk Road somewhat interrupted China's original dream of a controlled imperial center, Zhongguo, central kingdom, that limited access to its resources and people. The new China dream is trying to reach out beyond those boundaries. And interestingly, this translation would be something like, the rise of the nation is my dream. Now, this nation includes those minorities, but often they feel excluded. Now, if you remember the Olympics, I don't know if this video is going to, yeah, it is going to load. There was the unfolding of the scroll in the 2008 Olympics that sort of told China's view of its history, its past, and its future. And for the Chinese, it was a great moment of success, of vision, and the formulation of the China dream sort of policy. I think we see its origins in these 2008 Olympics. The slogan for the Olympics was "One World, One Dream." But that dream has to be fueled by something. And I'm proud to say that in 1997, I co-authored an article with James P. Dorian while we were both at the East-West Center that argued that this 1993 crossing of China's self-sufficiency in energy resources would lead to dramatic worldwide change and also a tremendous amount of social and ethnic unrest for China, particularly in the West. Some scholars have talked about this as a new Cool War. It's heating up between us and China in the Spratlys, and also between China and us and Russia in Central Asia. But nevertheless, energy is very critical to fueling this pattern of development. And as we saw the Chinese marching forward as part of their destiny, many Chinese believe, and the China dream that Xi Jinping was talking about in London recently, to bring these populations out. Now, of course, oil consumption in China has increased dramatically. It's also increased in India. But not too many people are as threatened by India. And there isn't as much concern about India's own growth in this region for several reasons that we can maybe talk about over dinner later. But clearly for the Chinese, the feeling is that they want to celebrate coming on the stage, on the world stage, and we saw that at the Olympics. But that celebration is often rather unsettling to us when we think, oh, there's only so much resource to go around, and are we going to? Now, it's also unsettling for us because of our account deficits, and I think what we saw in England is a similar sort of concern. This chart goes to 2004. You can see where we were at 2004. England was doing pretty good in 2004, but now they're coming to where we are, and not surprising, they're reaching out very strongly to China to try to halt this deficit. So much so that the British government has been accused of selling out to the Chinese. But I think it's a pattern that we've seen in the United States previously, a kind of realignment of the rhetoric about British-Chinese relations and U.S.-China relations, and also the need to deal with China in terms of resource development and cooperation, something that the pundits had a lot of fun with during this recent visit. I like that beer slide because I had read somewhere that if every Chinese drank 2 beers a day, there would be no hops left in the world. So, the Chinese I know drink a lot more than 2 beers a day. So this kind of development, this expansion of China has led people to sort of reassess. Kishore Bamabani was on my board of directors at the Pacific Basin Institute. I respect him greatly in Singapore, in U.S. And also Fareed Zakaria. Both have been talking a lot of this end of the American neo-empire, but also the feeling that America is taking a step back, that we're not really showing our muscles in the Middle East like we should be, and a lot of criticism of the Obama policy on this. I happen to disagree with that, but that criticism, and we can talk about more about that later if you wish. But clearly for this issue, the western region of China is critical. Not only does it have to go outside of its borders to garner resource all the way to the Middle East. This is what this Iron Belt Silk Road is to get rail lines. It already has pipelines to the Caspian Sea region. But also it has to go through this region known as Xinjiang. So suddenly that region has become what Owen Lattimore called the pivot of Asia. And it's pivotal not only because of its resources, which are greatly diminished, but also because of its access to external resources. And China's coal production basically has made has not slowed down. Despite its efforts to bring in external resources, it's still heavily reliant on coal. And that's going to affect everyone, not just the Chinese, in what some people are calling the air apocalypse, not the apocalypse. So this is a global concern. And we are still trying to unravel what exactly China is trying to do in the Middle East with its policy. Is it going to become engaged in Syria? Nobody really knows. There are some calls for China to become engaged. There's probably more at stake for China today in Syria than for us because of our changing situation. Now, Yitzhak Shakur, whom I was just with in Brussels at a conference where we spoke to the European Parliament about the Uyghur people, has been thinking about this Middle East foreign policy for China since 1979 when his book came out. And what's important in this book that he points out, and then others like myself, and there's been a series of writing and conferences on China and the Middle East, is that China did not really engage with the Middle East until the 1990s. And it's engaged with every country in the Middle East. It has an excellent relationship not only with Israel, but also Saudi Arabia and the Palestinian authorities. How do they do that? How do they do that? And for a while with Syria. The U.S. finally got around having a hearing in 2013 on this issue, and still scratching our heads. What are the Chinese doing in the Middle East? Why are they? What are some of their policies? And we find most writing about their engagements has been very threatened. We feel very threatened about China's engagement, and sort of somewhat late to this game. One thing I've been writing about is the role of China's Muslims in China's overseas policy. In the past, the Chinese leaders as communists were very reluctant to trust their own Muslims in foreign affairs and foreign diplomacy. Taiwan took the initiative. The first Taiwanese ambassador to Saudi Arabia was a Hui Muslim, Ma Bufang. And they had a long series of Muslims engaged in foreign policy and their foreign affairs. China has only recently begun to tap. I was just in Saudi Arabia last year. I met with Chinese Muslims there. Today, I think it's something like 1,500 Muslim Chinese studying in Medina at an international university. They've always been studying at Al-Azhar. In the 1980s, I was doing interviews in Egypt. And there's been a long history of Chinese students at Al-Azhar. But in the past, they had very little role. They've had some envoys. They haven't had, the PRC has not had any high-ranking diplomats yet that I know of that are Muslim, but they're getting there. And interestingly enough, Arabic is one of the fastest growing languages in China, not just for Muslims, but for Han. And the problem, one of the Arab teachers at the Foreign Languages College, where they have a big Arab Studies Institute donated by the Saudis, he said, the problem for us is that we train these imams to become imams and learn Arabic and the Quran, and they run off to become businessmen. We can't keep them in the mosque. And then all these Han want to learn Arabic. And so this very religious imam was telling me this is the problem with the, all the money to be made in learning Arabic and all the opportunities if you're a Muslim. So one of the issues for Muslims in China that divides them deeply, and we'll talk a little bit about the diversity among Muslims in China, but is this issue of Western China, the region known as Xinjiang, and it's become known as the Xinjiang problem. Now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I could have talked about the Tibet problem, and everybody would know where Tibet is and what some of the issues are and what the Dalai Lama, the kind of the map of Tibet. But if you said that about Xinjiang, nobody would, where, what, how do you pronounce it? Thanks to Xi Jinping, most people can get that X right now. But the Xinjiang 1T was something that you couldn't find an English book on. There were a few great articles and some earlier books on Islam in China. But a few of us got together and tried to get the best minds together and put this book out under the editorship of Frederick Starr. Came out in 2004, and we tried to list why this region is still and will increasingly become the pivot of Asia that Owen Lattimore saw it as. It had a rebellious history, great mineral departments, AIDS problems, etc. But one of the things we did in that book, and that I did, was to criticize China's policies and to suggest that there are a lot of issues in this region, but China's policies is going to worsen the situation for its local populations, particularly its Muslims. That's what led to this. I don't think any of you really want to see this stamp in your passport. It means that you can't go to China. It took me a while to find it. It's kind of in the back pages. It's basically just gives you the place and the date, and you don't really know what it means. It took about 4 years for all of us related to that book. 16 scholars, we're now known as the Xinjiang 13, have been blacklisted from going to China. Increasingly, scholars and journalists are getting blacklisted. I think we're the only group who has ever been as a group. It wasn't that we were saying, Xinjiang should be independent, Islam is the future, and jihadism is our passion. No, we were fairly moderate. But something in that book really ticked off certain people. There is apparently a memo signed by both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. As one Chinese friend of mine, colleague, told me, director of a think tank, said, it's really tough to get your name on a list like that. It's even tougher to get off. It takes even more power to get you off. So I have been able to go back to China on a limited basis, but not back to Xinjiang since 2003. In 2003, I was on a big collaborative Ford Foundation project. I had been to Xinjiang 10 times. To get there, it's not easy. A little easier now. But in 2003, I was going quite often thinking that I could do all kinds of things out there. I was riding horses up on the Altai Mountains near Mongolia. It was a lot of fun. But one of my students, also a co-author in the book, is here at GWU, and he's co-authored a piece that I think states it very well. That China has a carrot and stick approach to the region, and the carrot is no longer working. I think for 40 years it did sort of work. If you worked hard in the Chinese system, you could get along well as a Uyghur or as a Hui, or as a Muslim, or as a Tibetan even. But now that's breaking down for various reasons. And what we see as a result is a huge upsurge in violence related to the Uyghurs and the Xinjiang problem. We were predicting that in the early 2000s, but we were hoping that China would sort of revise some of its policies. Around China, and particularly surprising to some, was this Jeep incident. I put that in there, but I couldn't find. I guess it got deleted somehow. But there was a Beijing Jeep explosion. The Uyghurs ran their car into a crowd, somewhat like we've seen in Israel. Terrible accidents. It culminated sort of in 2009 with this huge riot in downtown Urumqi. Over 400 people were killed. It was widely covered in the Chinese media. And it took place right in downtown Urumqi, which surprised some of us because there are very few Uyghurs in Urumqi. Traditionally, the Uyghurs are in the south of the region. And it was widely covered in the media. This Uyghur Human Rights Project surprised me because they were putting links to Chinese media coverage. Normally they produce their own and sort of criticize the Chinese version, but it was so violent and so remarkable to see this ethnic violence. Now, I lived in LA during the Rodney King riots, and it reminded me almost exactly, and I think similar issues. These are little videos of what Urumqi looks like today. When I first went there in the early 80s, I was given permission to study this mosque. It was one of the tallest buildings in downtown Urumqi. And that's where the riots took place. And they're right by this tower, tower here. Used to be a tower, now it's dwarfed. And that was the Rabia Qadir building. And this is the Uyghur leader woman who started a sewing machine business in this building and became one of the wealthiest businesswomen in China today. But I was allowed to study. You can see it's a Chinese-style building, and that's a mosque. But it's a mosque for the Chinese Muslims, the Huis, not for the Turkic Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs don't go to that mosque. But it was close region to me as a Westerner, but I could go, I couldn't study the Uyghurs, but I could study the Huis. That's how I got to Tibet as well. I was going to study Muslims, but I did talk to a lot of Uyghurs and Tibetans at the time. This is China's plan. This is why China is developing the region. They want the taxes, they want the resources, they want to move their people out there. And it really does remind me of perhaps Houston, 40, 50, 60 years ago, where there's nothing much outside that region except for desert. But in the center, you see this mass development. Now, the Uyghurs have been accused of being terrorists. This violence is increasing. We have seen terrorism orchestrated by Uyghurs. But I think to some extent, this earlier analysis by Oxford Analytica, drawing on some of our work, is still true in a sense that many of them were made scapegoats for wider problems in Chinese society that we had tried to identify. In fact, in 2001, just 10 days before 9/11, the Chinese government itself said there was no terrorism in Xinjiang. Suddenly 9/11 happens. We need China's cooperation to move into Afghanistan and Iraq. And the Chinese agreed to not speak out against this or to work against this to allow us to do that. In turn, we agreed to support them in their crackdown on the Uyghurs, and that led to the arrest of the Uyghurs in Guantanamo Bay, this sort of anti-terrorism cooperation. So what's happened since then is the violence has spread, not only to Beijing, but also to Kunming down near the border of Burma and Thailand, and Yunnan, a place my father used to fly into. I had hoped to go to Kunming when I was allowed back in China that spring to do this study on the hump pilots that I'm working on now. But there the Uyghurs were in Kunming. Oh, he kept me out of Xinjiang. Now I can't even go down to Yunnan. I had been in Chongqing, and I had been going to some of the old airports that my father, and they're looking at some of the museums. And people were shocked. Why are the Uyghurs? There are no Uyghurs in Yunnan. There's all kinds of minorities, but not Uyghurs. And we later figured out that, I just wanted to show you this. All of these incidents in the past was very hard to find out what was going on in China. Now, thanks to the internet and thanks to the Uyghur Human Rights Project, they document all this and they have links to news reports, so it's a lot easier to keep track. I used to have a big Excel spreadsheet and try to figure out. It's very hard to get information. And still, most of these information is not independently verified. So you get a very different version from the Uyghurs and a very different version from the Chinese. But it's a very useful website. If you look for it, you can see this kind of Thailand. But many of us have been arguing that, this is not just a Uyghur problem. It has to do with civil unrest throughout China. And if you look, most of them are not in these border areas. These are these so-called mass incidents. Any civil unrest incident in China is documented now, admitted by the government as a mass incident. And so we've been arguing that it's really civil unrest. It's not Islamic-inspired violence or orchestrated terrorism or separatism. But increasingly so, we have seen not only a rise in Chinese mass violence, but also Uyghur violence. So much so that some people are saying that China might be reaching a tipping point, that social unrest has become so great and so widespread, worker, organized, et cetera, And this is the way China tries to prevent this, is increasing our harmonious society. But the harmonious society, and among the Uighurs, said this list of safeguard harmony and stability, this slogan of harmony, which is extended to ethnic unity, is really falling on deaf ears. Because it's harmony from the top down, forced upon them, and not from the bottom up. And we know what happens with that. One surprising thing, I thought, people, when we hear all this negative things about treatment of minorities, Muslims, Uyghurs, Tibetans, we tend to think that it's all bad, and that it's going bad, and that people are trying to get out of China and things like that. That's true, there is a lot of negative, but also population has gone up. And minorities are becoming so populous, and these are the official minorities of China, that one anthropologist, who himself is a Hui of Muslim background, Ma Rong at Peking University, is saying, hey, we need to rethink this policy. And we're breathing this out. Like, finally, Chinese scholars and think tanks are starting to rethink this policy. But instead of tweaking it, instead of giving real autonomy and real privileges, real educational opportunities, they want to get rid of it. It's not going to work. And he's arguing that if they don't get rid of it, it's going to become like the former Soviet Union. China will be dismantled by ethnic nationalism. This is what a Chinese anthropologist, Ph.D. at Brown University, very interesting project. So I know this group is interested in religion, Templeton, so I thought I'd pull out some of this data. It's an unpublished report about the growth of mosques. It's surprising that not only have we had an increasing number of people coming out and becoming Muslims, saying they're Muslims, saying they're minorities, but also we've had a dramatic growth in the number of mosques being built. And something we're surprised to hear that. The communists are going to, but when you compare the 1911s and 40s to today, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of mosques. And this study also compared Buddhist temples, Protestant churches, Catholic churches, Taoist temples, and Islamic mosques. And here are the mosques up here. I don't know if you guys probably can't see that. Sort of overall growth by this is hard. This is the percentage. It's hard to see that, but overall, the growth of mosques has been dramatic. But the growth of Protestant churches has also increased, and temples. That part we all know. But the mosque data was pretty new to me. I didn't realize it had been that significant. A lot of these mosques, the old mosques, are on a traditional Islamic style, but the new mosques these Muslims are building often are in this very modernist, some of them with funding from Saudi Arabia, some Wahhabi, some even Salafi. Another interesting development with this is the mass migration of Middle Easterners to China. In this little place called Yiwu, which is in Zhejiang, just south of Shanghai, we now have a vast number of Muslims where there never were any Muslims, Middle Easterners. There was never a mosque there. They're there to do trade. And basically, the largest number of Iraqis outside of Iraq is in China. We don't let them in the United States, but it's an extraordinary story that has not been very well told, but you can see what's happening with this level of migration. Now, of course, President Obama has been interested in China's issues of religion, particularly the Tibet concern, but interestingly enough, the Uyghur problem has not been on the agenda of this administration. I don't know if they're listening to Newt Gingrich or not, but we do know that the Dalai Lama has been hosted by President Obama, but not this woman. And this is Rabia Qadir with Václav Havel, the Dalai Lama, and she is the elected representative. This is that building that she built that's still standing. I'm surprised. It's still called the Rabia building in downtown Urumqi. I'm calling her the Dalai Mama because the Uyghurs don't have a Dalai Lama. They don't have a leader they listen to. And some of them may be listening to jihadi websites or Salafi radical jihadi Islam. But Uyghurs around the globe are also listening to her. She was in prison under the Bush administration. There was pressure put on China, and Condoleezza Rice did a great deal of work to help secure her release. The Chinese were upset when she immediately came out of China, began working on the behalf of the Uyghurs. She was nominated. She had received the Rafto Prize, has been nominated 4 times for a Peace Prize, for the Nobel Prize. There she is hugging my baby. And I was just with her in Brussels to promote the cause of the release of this man, a prominent Uyghur scholar, Ilham Tohti, who I did not know well, but he was just detained last year and given a life sentence, which really disappointed us. We were hoping that he would be released or maybe allowed to immigrate like his daughter. There's a fantastic documentary film on the web for free. You can watch it online. I can give you this link if you're interested, about his situation. He's an economist, and he was a teacher at the same college that I generally visit when I'm in Beijing, and I've been affiliated with the last 30 years. His daughter was supposed to get on the plane with him and go to Indiana when he was detained. And he just said to her, she's 18 years old, never left the country, said, go. And she got on the plane and now is in Bloomington, Indiana, 18-year-old young girl, all alone. And his family's been divided by this. And I was shocked reading her story about her father, that she says, in the end, of course I would go back to China. She would still go back to China. And she loves her country. And so for these Uyghur intellectuals, and he was a very moderate, and if you read a lot of his work that's posted on their website, you begin to find that the Uyghurs are dissatisfied. They hope for reform. But he says very clearly something that we said in our earlier book. If the Chinese keep up with this policy of pressure, 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 he says, yeah, 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 zhiyo, yeah. Pressure, 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 and then more pressure. He argues that it's going to become a movement, an Islamic movement, he says, that the Chinese have never seen the likes of which. It's an extraordinary video. Now, these organizations that are making these videos, that are electing Rabi'a Qadir, are very important for this transnational global Uyghur cause. We were just in Brussels. Some of you may have never heard of this UNPO. It's the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization. Tibetans are a part of it. Hawaiians are a part of it. When I lived in Hawaii, the Hawaiians, I knew they were very engaged. Some Native American groups are members. The Maori are very involved. 44 groups. And we met at the European Parliament recently and testified about the situation of the Uyghur there. Another organization that you may know of, the National Endowment for Democracy, funded this important conference for Uyghur women, where Rabi'a was present in Tallinn, in Estonia. And I was quite, they got their flag upside down there, so excited to be there. But I thought it was important that they were stressing the role of social media and bringing these Uyghurs from all over the world together, and the role of women in promoting this global diasporic movement. Also, it's interesting to see the Uyghurs look at Estonia and say, hey, a lot of people never believed Estonia would be independent. And there we are. Now, of course, the Uyghurs are part of China because of global Islam. They're Sunni. There are some Shiites in China, but they're not Uyghurs. They're Tajiks. For the most part, all of China's Muslims in Asia, vast majority are Sunni. There are no Shiite Muslims in China per se. And they're Turkic. They're Turkic speaking. So they've been a real thorn in the side for Sino-Turkish relations, because there's a tremendous amount of sympathy for the Uyghurs in Turkey. And Uyghurs, like the Turks, and this is why they were in Thailand trying to get out of Thailand and to get to Turkey, because they get free migration. If you're a Turkish person, Turkish background, whether you're Muslim or not, the Gago is going for it. So I was in part of this conference, and I was quite impressed at their level of organization, trying to raise awareness of the Uyghur situation and the fact that it's become a world issue, and bringing Uyghurs from, there's a large group in Australia, about 1 million Uyghurs outside of China, maybe 10 million inside of China. The Muslim population of China is about 21 million now, which is not a lot by world Muslim population figures, particularly the other Asian Muslims, but it's large by Middle Eastern standards. And of course, with China's growing role of investment in the Middle East, its Muslims are going to be even more critical to China's development. So global Islam is important to this whole factor of the Uyghur issue. And this is exactly why I think we've seen that the Uyghurs who got out of, the ones that didn't get out of China they stated when they were arrested that they were trying to get out of China and they couldn't. And that's why they went berserk with this knife attack. And this sort of frustration of not being able to get out. Some who have gotten out have been still engaged in trying to raise the consciousness of the Uyghurs that we've seen. And it was no surprise to us when we found out that this, in fact, when it happened, the Arrow and Shrine bombing, I was just scared to death. I thought, oh my God, it's probably a Uyghur. And then they showed the video of the guy, and he looked like a Uyghur, and lo and behold, he probably is. And we don't have everything in on this, but basically the bombing outside of China and Thailand is this guy, Adem Karada, who came from Xinjiang to Yunnan, made his way with a fake passport out to Istanbul, but then went back to Thailand to do this bombing. And then, of course, it made me think of the Boston Marathon bombers. They were Chechens. And a disgruntled young man is going to do crazy, horrible things. And the Uyghur problem used to be pretty much confined to Xinjiang, then Beijing, then Kunming, and now Thailand. And you have this enormous Uyghur diaspora that's desperate, that's angry, and that feel that their cause is being ignored, while other groups. So I think this message is the message that we've been writing about since the early 2000s, that a lot of China's policies are exacerbating the problem. And there are some things Chinese can do, and the Parliament testimony I gave some alternative suggestions, like using the Alaska model, using the Maori model for the Uyghurs' land. But you bump up against the China dream, and the China dream is not tolerant of these voices of dissent. You have to be part of the dream. And I keep wondering if it's a Mongol dream. The Mongols already dreamt this dream, and they were successful at carrying it out. In the Olympics, we remember that the one world, one dream was interrupted, and they were startled. Chinese were startled awake, I think, by the protests and the resistance to that dream. But nevertheless, Xi Jinping has continued to push this. I was surprised in 1989, right before the Tiananmen protest, just a week before, the government allowed its Muslims to protest a book that they found offensive to Islam. In fact, the government even, this is the cover of my first book, the government even supplied these scarves. And I think the idea was, we're a democratic country, you can protest, here you go, but the students, they're not allowed to protest. In this protest, I was always impressed to see there was a Uyghur, there was a Hui, there was a Kazakh, representing the three largest groups of Muslims in China, again, about 21 million, about 10 million Uyghurs, about 11 million Hui, and the rest very small groups. But how do they fit into this dream of China? How do they see themselves as fitting into this dream? Now, the Uyghurs themselves are quite eclectic in their religion. And so that history gives me some confidence in suggesting that they're not going to easily fall into the arms of radical Islam. They're largely Sufi. They actually are very localized. Not too many devout Salafi Wahhabi Muslims would put a Monkey King poster on a Bismillah. But Uyghurs do look towards Mecca, like all Muslims. They are part of the global Islam. Their prayer books, they face towards Mecca, a different direction. And I'm not sure if this video, there it is, going to load, but we need to move along, I know. But remember that for the Uyghurs, they only recently converted to Islam. Prior to that, for most of their history, they were shamans, shamanistic. And in this Sufi video, if you could hear, you'd hear the shaman's drum pounding, and they're chanting the words of Allah. If you know about the whirling dervishes in Turkey, those are also, they were getting some. Whirling dervishes with the beating of the drum, that's the shaman's drum. And they're calling the name of God. But instead of saying Allah, they're saying Khuda. And because of the role of Persian and Urdu in Uyghur language, which is a Turkic language. And here you can see, and I guarantee you, if you dance around in 100-degree heat like I did with them, you do experience divinity. You really get transported to another realm. But in between, there were also Christians, they were also Buddhist, and they were also Manichaean. So the Uyghurs are very eclectic, and the Sufism that they have is not susceptible to a radical message of Islam. Let me conclude by citing my mentor, Clifford Geertz. I had the privilege of spending a year with him at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton before he died recently. And he had an article that always I was really thinking about blurring the genres between the social sciences and the humanities. But as I was rereading that article, I was thinking, you know, what is happening today is this blurring of genres between and borders between the nation, the state, and religion. And what's bumping up against the state in China is this translocal, transnational global religion of Islam that is uniting Uighurs against China and may bring all of its Muslims together, like that protest Salman Rushdie. It certainly is uniting the Uighurs against China like we'd never seen before. In terms of recommendations, I'll conclude here. This is a wonderful little mosque that is no longer there. It was plowed over because they wanted to put a road along the north side of the Yellow River that's just across the river from Lanzhou City. And when they plowed that mosque down, of course, you know, New York Times called me and CNN called me. Are they oppressing Muslims? Are they, you know, anti-religious? Are they knocking down temples, knocking down churches? I said, no, they're just doing street widening. And if it was a temple, they'd knock it down too. If it was a Communist Party headquarters, they'd knock it down too. If it was an old tree, they might go around it. But in this case, I think it basically suggests that for China, its development and its participation in the global economy is critical to its success, to keeping the party in power. But these non-state actors are threatening China just as they are to us and to the nation-state system. And also that most religious movements, world religions, according to Max Weber, are world religions by the very fact that they are global, they're mobile, they have a text, and Muslims participate in this world religious tradition. But what's happening with groups like ISIS is saying, hey, we want an Islamic state, not a nation-state system. And that's appealing to often the unsettled people, to people who have not made it well in the nation-state system. China should engage, I think, as a responsible stakeholder with transparency about its geostrategy. In other words, people want China to take a part in, in anti-terrorism cooperation, for example, but we're also very suspicious of what's the real agenda here. What's really going on in the Middle East. So we need a lot more transparency, particularly in the South China Sea and other places. And then finally, I think the US must move from a containment policy, which we read during the Cold War era under Doak Barnett, who was very influenced on President Nixon and Reagan and Kissinger's policy, to an engagement policy with China on this issue. And that remember that when China was at its peak of strength, it rarely expanded territorially, only to what was thought to be part of China's society. Yeah, stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think you did address all the topics that I wrote you about. Anyway, we're open for questions. Peyton will come around with a microphone. We ask you to speak directly into the microphone. Nelson Wolf, right here.
I have two quick questions and a quick comment. The two quick questions: do the Uighurs look like the other Chinese? And do they have access to higher forms of education, medicine, law, etc.? And the quick comment: is it my imagination, or is it only Islam that cannot integrate into the other societies?
Very good questions. I'm not sure I can handle them very well, but all well in one answer. Yes, and no. Yeah, I think that the Uighurs can look very Chinese, but for the most part, they do look more Turkic, more Mongolian. They come out of the Altai region of the Ordos region of northern Mongolia. That was their homeland. But in some cases, they can blend very in. The difference with the Hui are descended from Arabs and Persians and Turkic traders, and they intermarried with the Chinese population over 1,200 years. So the Hui look very Chinese. I have met some Hui, the Chinese-speaking Muslims, with green eyes and red hair. But you'll find that more often among some Uighurs. Dokun Kambari, Ph.D. Columbia's green eyes, blonde hair. But they don't blend in as well with Chinese society as the Hui do. And they often say this, oh, those Hui, they're more Chinese. They just take off their white hat and they blend right in. And the question about Islam blending in, compared to other religious traditions in China, I think that to some extent in China, the reason I brought up the Hui is that the Hui are an example of how well they've blended into Chinese society, and as a contrast to the Uyghurs. Now remember, Xinjiang has only been integrated really, firmly into Chinese society in the last 10 years, I think, but formally in the last 50 years. So it's not had that long history of engagement with Chinese culture and society. Hui promoted a Neo-Confucian reinterpretation of Islam that's very well integrated into Chinese society. And I think in general, the vast majority of the world's population of Muslims are integrated fairly well into many of their societies, or would like to be. And it may take time. And for the case of the Hui, it took some time. In China, there's a lot of other religious groups that have not integrated well, such as the Falun Gong, which is a Chinese movement. A movement that the Chinese find more threatening than Islam and have been much more repressive. Tibetans as well. Despite having a Dalai Lama, a leader of peace, we've had a lot of violence in Tibet. Some of it turned on themselves through self-immolation. But in 2008, right before the Olympics, we saw huge unrest. And interestingly enough, the Tibetans turned a lot of their violence on the Hui, Muslims, because they were the traders, they felt doing business on part of the Chinese. I think I missed your second question.
The second question, do they have access to higher forms of
education, yeah, that's a good question. They did before. In fact, Ilham Tohti, the guy that's under arrest, is a good example of that. His dad went to college, but his dad died during the Cultural Revolution, and we know nobody really knows how. He was a teacher, probably struggled against, and now he's been arrested. He went to university in Xinjiang, and then he went to graduate school in Beijing. He speaks perfect Mandarin, and it's unfortunate to see someone like that, that's articulate, that's moderate, that they can't function in Chinese society. What's happened in Xinjiang is there has been a lot of opportunity for education, particularly at the elementary level, but a lot of the more elite education and higher education has been increasingly restricted because of fears of organization and nationalism. So also the economy, it's more turned into a market economy, whereas you could tell the Communist Party could just send a teacher out to Kashgar and say, you got to spend your 3 years there. Now they've got to pay them well. And often the local governments don't have the money to pay those teachers. So the teachers out in these rural Uyghur areas are worse and worse. And then the repression is even greater. So kids don't really have a lot of reason, they think, for going to school and making it in the Chinese system. There's this brain drain. The ones at the top who do very well in the Chinese education often leave Xinjiang to go to interior China to get jobs and do well. And those at the bottom get displaced by workers who do the jobs for a lot less money and things, and don't have the Chinese to capitalize on those opportunities.
Steve Elkwood?
Yes.
In the area of religion, you know, I'm not sure. I was a little confused. ISIS is a Sunni organization.
Right.
In the Middle East, the Sunnis are fighting the Shias. In China, you said all these organizations are also Sunni organizations. Does ISIS really have pull with them, or the other Sunni groups, or Saudi Arabia, who's fighting against the Shia?
Yeah.
And will that lead to more unrest as opposed to less?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Because the one thing we can get out of the way is we know there are no Shiites in China to speak of. So it's all a Sunni problem for China. Within the Sunnis, there's a lot of tension between the Wahhabis, the more orthodox, and then within that, the Salafis, the ultra-orthodox, and to some extent, the jihadist Islamists. And that's kind of the spectrum. On the China side, you also have, and also throughout the Middle East, you also have Sufis. You also have other reformist Muslims, Muslim Brotherhood, for example, who may not agree with the message of ISIS. I think for the Uighurs, who have been supported by some of these groups, they're not that interested in the radical Islamist message. They're interested in training, they're interested in financial support, but they're much more interested in liberating their homeland. They're nationalists first. Islam is very powerful. I wouldn't say Muslim second, but for them, I use the term ethno-religious identity. That religion is a part of their identity, but so is being Uyghur and being attached to that land. So we know that there were some Uyghurs who were apparently fighting and being trained by ISIS in Syria, and they were taken out and shot. Because probably, we're guessing, we don't really know, but we're guessing because they didn't want a global Ummah, they wanted a free Eastern Turkestan. And that message is antithetical to their cause. We know they've fought with the Chechens. We know they've been trained by the Taliban. But I think for the most part, and from what we learned from the 21 unfortunate men who spent over 10 years in Guantanamo Bay, some of them might be terrorists, but they're terrorists toward the Chinese, not towards us. And we don't arrest every terrorist, Shining Path or ETA. That's somebody else's problem. My message today is that the Uyghurs might be increasingly our problem unless something is done about Chinese policy in the region. If you were a tourist in Thailand on that day, at the Erawan Shrine, which I visited, you might have been caught up in that. And I think that pressure on that radicalization of dispossessed, unemployed, angry young men, as we saw in Boston, can spill over anywhere. And it has to do with reform, with educational opportunity. I think what we see so much with the Arab Spring going bad is that these young men were full of hope and they were unsettling these governments, but then nothing's changed. And their economic situation is worsened and rather than improved.
We'll give the last question to Philo Wang, who is a student at Germantown Friends. He's going to begin an internship at FDRI in January on Xinjiang.
Oh, great. Gladden is.
Dr. Gladney. So I was born and raised in Xinjiang. I was actually in Urumqi 2 months ago. I'm not a Han nor a Uyghur. My mom is a Kazakh. My father is a Hui. Oh. And one phenomenon I'm noticing is that less and less young people from my ethnic group speak our own tongue. Mm-hmm. I'm not really fluent in Kazakh, and a lot of my friends who are Uyghur are not actually fluent in Uyghur language. We all start speaking Chinese now. And what's your opinion on Chinese government's kind of assimilation policy in the region? Yes.
Thank you. Did you grow up in Urumqi?
I was born in Tachin, Chushek. It's like a town in Altai Mountains. And
yes.
I moved to Urumqi for elementary school.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's why I was surprised the riots that took place in Urumqi, because the Uyghur population is very small in Urumqi, as you know. It's not a traditional Uyghur center of population. It was Russians, founded by the Russians, the city. It's also very unusual to see intermarriage among Muslim groups, Hui and Kazakh. Only among the elite and the educated families do you generally see this. I don't know anything about your background. You rarely see intermarriage between Hui and Uyghurs, or Uyghurs and Kazakhs, almost none. And I was studying Kazakhs, my last project, and spending a lot of time with Kazakhs up in the mountains. And of course, the nomadic Kazakhs, only about 1/3 of the population. Most of the other Kazakhs are in towns and cities. And many of them are quite well educated. But as you know, to make it in Chinese society, you have to make it in Mandarin. You have to speak good Chinese. And what was remarkable about Ilham Tohti is he speaks beautiful Chinese. I hope you get a chance to watch that movie. He gives a very moving speech about the need to reform and also talks about educational opportunities. I actually think China has a very strong bilingual education policy, much stronger than the United States. As you know, in Xinjiang, newspapers, radio broadcasts, television shows are in multiple languages. And they continue at elementary education to promote Uyghur language. But there has been in recent years increasing restrictions on it. Some Chinese policymakers, I have a student who just did a Ph.D. dissertation on this, on bilingual education in China. There's a big debate in China about this. Some policymakers think that they're doing their locals, kids, a disservice by allowing them to continue to learn in Tibetan, because they need to have Chinese to make it in Chinese society. So I think it's an open debate. I think the part that's not well known is that the Chinese are much stronger on bilingual education than almost any other country, except for maybe Switzerland, in terms of preserving many minority languages, which were never even written until the communists came along. So they translated, they wrote, they produced books, a lot of it for propaganda purposes. This is why there's a television in every Chinese house and cell phones work so well, because the government wants to get its message out and watch its population. But at the same time, a lot of these languages, particularly the small minority groups, would have disappeared, I think, a long time ago if it hadn't been for this state apparatus that actually preserves a lot of minority languages. And it is remarkable, particularly among the Hui, the Hui don't have a minority language. They speak whatever language they live in, Cantonese in the south, Mandarin in the north, but yet they've been learning Persian and Arabic as a part of their religious duty, and the government has had no restrictions on that. And Hui mosques are full in Gansu and Qinghai. It's really the Uighurs that have experienced the repression of the state because of the political concerns, not so much of concerns about Islam, which we see thriving among Hui and other groups, Dongshang and things like that. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.